Hello and welcome to Amarilla's Art. Today I'm going to go over my process for creating a comic. This Grumpy Veggies comic that I do, I generally start out with a sketch. Sometimes I do it in a notebook and sometimes I do it in Photoshop. This specific episode I decided to do in Photoshop, and as you can see I'm starting to block out the scenery for the characters. I did kind of already write up what I wanted the characters to say for this episode on a notepad, so I've got that to the side while I'm working on this as a reference so that I know what the characters are going to say, and then I kind of decide what their poses will be as I go along and do the sketching. I use a light blue pencil for the sketching just because that way I don't have to turn the opacity down if I were to use like a black pencil. I know that for professional pencilers they generally use a blue that's this sort of color, that's a blue that if you photocopy it, it won't show through. So that's particularly useful if you're working on paper and you want to just ink right on top of the sketch. So that way you can just scan it in and then the scanner won't pick up this blue. I think they call it photocopy blue pencil or something like that. I don't always know exactly how many pages I'm going to start out with. For this episode I didn't quite know what I wanted the last text to be, so I kind of figured that out on the fly in this sketch. You can see that I had an idea that wasn't quite as funny, that didn't ring as well, so I decided to delete it and try something else. After I finish the sketching, I like blocking in the text next. I like having the text and the speech dialogue boxes right there before I start inking, so that way I don't have to ink and then erase it later. I also like adding in the effects text at this point, so that, again, I know where I don't need to ink. It makes it a lot easier later when I'm doing colors, so that I don't have lines that I've accidentally left behind from inking before putting in the text, so that way I can just put in the color. Now, I don't necessarily like how lumpy and malformed the speech bubbles that I draw are. I've got a very shaky hand, unfortunately, but most everybody that I talked to highly recommended hand drawing speech bubbles rather than trying to do a pen and ink method rather than doing a vector drawing, just because it looks more natural. And surprisingly, doing a vector drawing with perfectly curved lines ends up looking rather odd and kind of looks like it doesn't fit. So after some market research, so to speak, mostly users on Reddit giving me suggestions of what to and what not to do, I decided that I would just hand draw in the speech bubble each time. I'm not sure if there's a better way to draw the speech bubble in than I usually do, but yeah, so now I'm going in through the inking, and because I did a pretty good detailed sketch, I'm able to just ink right on top of it. Sometimes I'm a little lazy, so I don't always draw super good sketches, and then I kind of have to wing it when I ink it. Fortunately for this one, though, I did it pretty well. I'm adding tig-ass biddies for the anime figurines, because you can't be an anime otaku and not have tig-ass biddy anime figures. I recently asked my most common viewers for my comic which type of background they preferred, if they preferred just color or detailed backgrounds, and it was almost overwhelmingly they preferred detailed backgrounds, which is something that I've read is generally better to do as well. So it's a little harder, it takes a little more work, but I think it makes the comic look a little more polished. Probably makes it look a little nicer too. More enjoyable to view, even if the art isn't super great. These figurines are nothing for me to write home about, for sure. But it adds depth to the world and makes it more interesting to look at. I do a lot of copying and pasting for my sketches and for my inking, just so that way it looks similar from drawing to drawing. If I hand draw each new frame, sometimes it looks sloppy and it doesn't look exactly the same, so it can be a little jarring for when I'm doing a reread to see if it looks okay. So I found that just copying and pasting the inks, while slightly lazy, it does make the comic seem a little more cohesive. Yeah, this is what I was mentioning earlier, where I don't need to draw the extra lines. I tried not to draw over the sigh with the couch lines so that it stands out a little easier, or a little more. Okay, now I'm doing the flatting of the coloring, and I'm not a particularly excellent flatter. But what I did learn, I learned from the Colors with Kurt video that's on how to color comics. And he just goes over the entire process for doing a digital coloring, where you flat the comics, and then you do the shading on top of the flats, and then you do the special effects, or the SFX. And you just have those each as separate layers. And I don't follow exactly the steps that he recommends for the later phase of coloring, rather than just flatting. But that's just partially laziness on my part. You can't not have a pink-haired anime girl. I found that for drawing a more detailed background for this comic, it made it easier to figure out what the background color for each panel should be, because when it's set in a specific space, then I know, oh, they're sitting on the gray couch, so I need to make the background color gray. Whereas when I don't do a detailed background, it's a little harder for me to figure out. I gotta try and decide what color of mood the characters are feeling, and then try to set that as the background color. So it takes a little longer to draw the detailed backgrounds, but I think it's worth it because it makes it easier on me to decide what colors I need to use, and my readers enjoy it more. It's just a more interesting world than just an empty void, an empty pastel colored void, like my earlier comics. But I was still learning how to create comics in an efficient way when I started my first one, so I was kind of just doing the best that I could with what skills I had. And I've gotten a lot better as I've gone along just in these last couple months, so I've certainly learned how to color things a lot better. I used to just use the airbrush for doing shading, and it looks okay, but I recently discovered that using my hard edge wet ink brush looks a lot better for doing shading. So I think that's something that I might have been able to learn from watching a YouTube video. But it's something that I just kind of organically discovered while working on one of my other comics. And so I've utilized that ink brush in this comic for a better shading than I was getting in my previous comics. It's kind of exciting. Each comic is a little better. I push myself a little bit to try something I haven't before. In this one I tried to do more detailed background than I usually do. I tried to do each panel with some sort of background. For some of my earlier comics, I had an established scene so that you knew where they were, but then I kind of got lazy and didn't draw the rest of the background. But for this one, I decided to push myself and draw the strawberry, Bob the Strawberry, sitting on his couch for each scene, rather than to just let it kind of fade into the background. Hopefully that makes my comics look better. Oh yeah, this panel, These panels, I tried doing the airbrush for the shadowing, for the background, for the wall, but it just didn't look as good as the solid shading, so I decided to just go back with the brush and do the harder edges. And it's harder to like fake it with the harder edges if you don't have a concrete edge. It'll look really funky, so you have to put a little more attention into it, but it's worth it. I think it looked pretty good. It was hard to figure out how to shade his strawberry leaves because they're not super detailed. They're just kind of an amorphous round blob. But I think I did all right. Yeah, I just completely skipped doing any airbrushing for the shadows for this point. I did use the airbrush to do the light glow on their faces, but that's because it's a more diffuse light that's coming off the television that's hitting their faces. That's why I decided to use the airbrush for that, rather than just kind of copping out to the airbrush. I don't think I could have done the hard edge shadowing when I first started, just because I didn't entirely understand how the shadows worked, because most of my drawings up until now have been in a generic, blandly lit space. So just by drawing 1 or 2 comics every week, I just learned a lot about how the shadows need to look, or how they need to move on the surface to make them look more legitimate. Thanks for watching. I hope you got something useful out of this video. I'll see you guys next time.